Hi, Tammy. Great to have you here and be having a conversation today about leadership. It's something you've got an enormous amount of experience in, decades in organizational leadership and ministerial leadership, and your own Doctor of Leadership qualification that you're doing. So I wondered if we could start with, could you just, tell us what you've noticed about leadership? Because I say you have noticed it over a long period of time. Well, what have you seen happen, and how do you think we've got to where we are today with leadership? I mean, you could talk for a couple of hours on that, but
I could. I was thinking about this leading up to this conversation, Jason, and one of the things that I think is missing that goes
yeah,
back to me starting as a spiritual leader is what is the motivation that I am bringing to this moment?
mm,
Because understanding my personal motivation for the moment
yeah,
is the leadership about me?
hmm
Is it truly to make a difference for the sake of others? That beginning place is foundational because then out of that, the characteristics of my leadership flow. And for whether it's a group of people coming together, whatever the model of leadership is not what's important, but what are we bringing
mm,
into the leadership? And I am so biased that everything starts from the inner core of who we are.
yeah,
The crisis of leadership is when we have people that are more about themselves
hmm
than they are the moment and the others that they are in fact serving for, we end up in crisis.
hmm. So, do you think that the reasons people have gotten into leadership have changed over the years?
I don't know that we've changed. I think moments create moments. And what I mean by that is, when all of the factors come together, some that preceded us and some that we've caused, and
Yeah,
they create a moment. Then what rises up in us is, do we see ourselves as the saviors that we can come in and fix it? Are
mm,
we coming in as critics that we didn't like everything that happened before us?
mm,
What are we bringing in?
mm,
And I don't think that it's changed because humans are humans
yeah,
uh, in what we are becoming. And yet at the same time, I think different moments bring out different things in us.
right. Mm. So, how do you think the moment we're in has is bringing out something different? Is it bringing out something different at the minute?
Well, I think, it depends on where you're looking.
Mm,
Um, I think in the church, I see a lot of spiritual leaders, pastors who have tried everything they've been trained in for decades, and it's no longer working.
hmm,
And when it's no longer working in the same way, where do we go for answers?
mm,
Do I look at how do I fit this moment? Leadership for me, sometimes it's positional, sometimes it's not a position, it's a place of influence that you have in
mm,
people's lives. And when we come to this moment, what are we bringing? And this is where, we'll get into the conversation. And the thing that we share in common and love is this differentiated leadership
mm,
and what it means. There's so much to that word that's so critical in this moment. So whether
mm,
it's the church, whether it's our politics, where there seems to be kind of a savior mentality,
mm,
right now there's a lot of fear.
mm,
All of those negative emotions that come up that can motivate people, but motivate toward what end is
mm.
really important.
Yeah. I again might be wrong on this, but one of the three sort of leadership buckets for me have been skills. What's the context we're in?
Sure.
What do you need to be able to do as a leader?
Mhm.
Another one is resilient. You've always needed to be resilient as a leader and fortitude. But an emerging third one has been is preempted by the first two. You can't outskill this current moment, and you can't out resilience it. Is what it feels like. It's like you just can't resilience your way through this, or find the right techniques. There's something fundamental about the identity of a leader in this moment that needs a different response. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I see, I think both of those, if you're thinking about resiliency, it's how am I going to continue through this moment? And skills, what am I going to bring to this moment? And I think that's why I'm going back to the starting place.
Yeah.
I think skills are essential, but I have seen really excellent leadership come out of people who didn't have the skills per
Mm,
se to do what was needed at the moment, but what they had was the wisdom to know that, and
mm,
the wisdom to know who to bring alongside who
mm,
had the skills, which I think makes for better leadership.
mm,
Rather than one person believing they need to bring everything to the moment and move aside if they don't have what it takes. I think, well, what if the need of the moment is really wisdom, Jason? And that's what is my core word,
wisdom.
is the wisdom to understand what is the applied knowledge that's needed here,
Yeah.
and who has the competency to do
Mm,
what's need to be done. It doesn't always have to be even by the person who's called the leader. I think that's the beauty of leadership, is because it can function in a myriad of ways and be really excellent.
yeah. How much do you think, you know, if we need to be a certain kind of person, but we're often not, what comes to mind? Things like control and ego and all those
Right.
perennial things. There doesn't seem to be anything new about human beings, is there, that gets in the way of being a certain kind of leader that's needed. Do you see anything different, or is it just similar dynamics intensified at this moment?
Absolutely. It's just dynamics intensified. This is why I go back to whether it's the wisdom, the motivation, which is what we're really speaking to is the person of the leader. Who have
Mm,
I become up to this moment? And I
yeah.
don't think, if you get to the point you go, well, I'm in this crisis and I see I don't have the maturity, the wisdom, the whatever it is, should I step aside? Well, sometimes. But there are other times when you go, okay, here's my opportunity to
Mm,
lean in and become. And
yeah.
actually, that is a wonderful leadership mark to do that vulnerably and open before people and say, let's do this together. So even that can have some excellent leadership quality in vulnerability to say, I'm not there, but we could
Yeah.
do this together. Yeah.
Yeah. And why do you think leaders aren't vulnerable and
Hmm.
open? I mean, I remember hearing years ago, never trust a leader that doesn't walk with a limp. And there's some good truth to that. And there are some leaders that try to pretend that they're something they're not. But, we still seem to be tripping over this on an industrial scale at the minute with people. It's like,
Yeah.
why aren't we being what we need to be?
Well, part of it, I think the public demands competence. So there's a fear that if I'm vulnerable, they'll think I'm not competent.
Mm,
And this is the difference, I think, when that inner core is so strong, that's been built on the inside, that I know who I am, I know who I'm not. It's actually the mark of humility. And I don't need to be what I'm not. There are plenty of others who are that I can empower
yeah,
and support.
yeah,
Um, that kind of person, I think, is what is going to be emerging out of this, Jason. I really do. I believe that all of this craziness that we see everywhere we look, those are the moments when people with the deepest character,
yeah.
greatest integrity, they're vulnerable because they have nothing to fear. I find vulnerability shuts down in an atmosphere of fear for
Interesting.
whatever reasons. Those fears can be many.
Mm,
But when there's nothing on the inside to fear,
hmm,
that vulnerability is not a problem, because then there's even the wisdom of what to be vulnerable in and how vulnerable to be, what's helpful, what's not.
yeah,
Um, and that, honestly, more times than not, I see true vulnerability is a stabilizer in a strange way.
mm,
It calms everyone down.
yeah.
It brings us back to what's really important and just de escalates the moment. Usually, vulnerability is one of the de escalating factors that can happen in a moment.
Mm. I'm thinking about having been a pastor for 25 years, and
Mhm.
the many hundreds and hundreds of ministry leaders I talked to, and I was talking to a wonderful young pastor yesterday, and just the relentless juggernaut of pressure of expectations in a church context from friends, family, staff, church community, extended community, denominational community, all these people. Just makes me wonder how do you do vulnerability when other people's jobs are on the line?
Hmm.
You know, never mind reputation and ego, but just that when I get it, I get that, hey, if you've got nothing to fear, you can be vulnerable. But other people are like, but if I'm vulnerable there,
Hmm.
that could affect my family or these people I work with. How do we navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's where I say the wisdom of it. There's a,
Mm,
there's an experimental vulnerability that I've used often,
okay.
which I test the moment.
All right.
An experiment is I try different things to test a hypothesis.
Okay.
And so I have a theory. Okay, so what do we do in our doctoral work? I
Mm,
did all this research, all this reading, and I created a theory.
yeah.
And then I went out and tested it
Mm,
in a number of different areas.
yeah.
Um, I test vulnerability all the time.
Huh.
I walk into every environment, reading the room,
Yeah.
taking the temperature,
Yeah.
and testing vulnerability.
Mm,
And usually I'll listen to the conversation
yeah.
and think, what is needed in this moment? What could I try? And see
Mm,
what it does. Does it invoke more fear? Do I need to be more certain in this moment? Or
mm,
does it cause people to relax and go, oh, now I can do this too?
mm,
I think people are looking for leaders who will show them it's okay for them to exhale too. I
yeah.
think the whole world is so anxious right now. Even the demands, I wonder, are they really demands or are they fears?
Mm,
Are they fears that our whole world is falling apart around us? And
yeah.
are they looking for someone who's not afraid, who's not
Mm,
shaken at the moment, and can test a little vulnerability and see what it does in the room?
I like that. Test a little bit, see what it does. Very powerful. I mean, I know you and I both know Edmund Friedman and Failure of
Oh, yeah.
Nerve.
Yes.
There's a book on being a non-anxious presence, and it's. I'm just listening to you there and thinking, yeah, how much is this pressure for competence and achievement and results and not failing
Yeah.
generates fear. If I say I don't know, if I say I'm not sure, if I say I haven't been able to do that yet, we fear that the repercussions. So is it, you get to try that out and go, hey, I don't know. Is it as simple as that and see what
It
happens?
is. It is.
I don't
Um,
know. What do you think?
I don't leave an I don't know answer as if there is no way of knowing. See, there's a difference between I don't know, but it doesn't mean it's unknowing.
Yeah.
And I think that's where vulnerability says, we'll do this together, we'll go alongside. I'm going to
Mm,
find the answer. That's the confidence that I'll, rise up with. I don't
good.
know, but we'll find the answer.
Mm,
I don't know, but we'll go through this together.
yeah.
And, I draw on human history, and I find that the older I get, the more special this part of this process is
Yeah.
because, when I see people really anxious about certain things, I start talking about the late 60s when I was a little girl sitting in front of the news, on the television of that little black and white screen and
Yeah.
feeling what I felt watching my parents' reaction
Mm,
to the late 60s and early 70s. And so I can say to people, yes, things look really dark, but you know what? This isn't the first time
mm,
they've been here before. I can say to the church, let's go through church history. let's let's
yeah.
talk about where we've been before. That
Yeah.
there's nothing new under the sun, and pointing everything. I think Jason, it tests us.
Mm,
I wanted to say this. It tests us for
mm,
spiritual leadership.
mm,
I start every act of leadership by being a follower.
mm,
Because if I don't start first and foremost as a follower in the church and understand that really the only leader in Lord is Jesus, and he's the only savior that's needed. I am a member of this body, functioning out of the capacities that He gave me to do a
Yeah.
certain thing in this body that He gave me to do. But I'm not responsible for it.
Mm.
He is. I'm responsible to obey. I'm
Yeah.
responsible to trust and to listen.
Yeah.
And I think people are looking for spiritual leaders who
Mm.
have that kind of quiet confidence that we know who we are following. And
Mm.
He's not going to lead us off the cliff.
Mm. Not sure why pops into my head thinking about, well, vulnerability. There's something that seems to have emerged recently, sort of the opposite of people not being vulnerable and toxic vulnerability. People sharing deeply and profoundly about their brokenness and stuff. And it's actually just another cover
Yeah.
for, very inappropriate brokenness. And people go, it's all right to have a leader with the limp, but here's someone, who's in a wheelchair and both their arms and legs are broken. And I stretch the metaphor. Have you noticed anything about toxic
Oh, yeah.
vulnerability?
I think it's going with our fragility, trauma, culture.
Mm,
And all of those, I'm so grateful they're being talked about. I'm so grateful it's coming to the surface
mm,
because I've also seen the damage caused by deeply wounded leaders who never got healed out of fear. And so
mm,
they just became more and more toxic and controlling and demanding to cover up that which they need to cover up. So
yeah,
I'm very grateful that it's all coming to the surface. But
yeah.
as anything with humans, we can get stuck if
Mm-hmm,
we're not becoming that prototype of humanity that Jesus was. And one
yeah.
of the things that I see in this is that when you're talking about your woundedness while you're in it,
Mm-hmm,
it tends to go toxic
mm,
because you're in the middle of the wound.
mm,
So as a leader, if you're using that as the vulnerability, it's probably not going to go well.
yeah.
Uh, you use that for healing and you get vulnerable with the people who help bring healing to you, but not in your leadership moment.
Yeah.
In the leadership moment, the greatest story is I once was blind, but now I see.
Mm-hmm,
I once was deeply broken in this area, and now I am healing or healed. The
yeah.
healed, the old language of the healed helper,
Mm-hmm,
the healed whole helper.
mm,
And the reason for that is because the leader is I'm a few steps ahead on the journey, so I can show the way
mm,
because I've been experiencing it.
mm.
Where if I'm just vulnerable with where I am, that erodes confidence in leadership.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
is there hope? Are you healing out of this? Or are you stuck in drama too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. That's great. If I go back to the domain of skills, what's again? Let's say you're sitting down with a young leader in their 20s, and you know, and you were to give focus on something like one. I know it's impossible, but one perennial skill. What do leaders need that they've always needed that they still
Well,
need? What would
you
you say?
know, it's this current moment is really interesting to talk about this. And I've been saying to people, I am not saying this because I am the executive dean of the seminary.
Yeah.
I am going to say this because I've experienced it and I've watched it over the years. Education, when it's done well,
Mm-hmm.
is extremely formative for us. And you and I have talked about this before. The critical thinking skills that are needed today
Mm. Critical thinking. Yeah.
are off the charts. I mean, they're
Yeah.
always needed, but especially in times of
Mm-hmm.
severe crisis. Critical thinking skills that we bring our whole selves, we bring our emotions, we bring our minds, we bring our spirit, or so all of us comes to it. But we need our minds
Yeah.
to have really good critical thinking skills that we can dig through all of the height of emotion and all of the flaming words that are being thrown back and forth.
Mm.
And we can speak words of life because we've thought deeply about this. And you learn that with good education. It's
Yeah.
why I think we need to understand what's going around us. We need to understand how to interpret scripture in this moment.
Mm,
We need to know how to talk about the authority of scripture in this moment, and
mm,
what it is and who it is, all
yeah.
of those things that we don't learn outside of that environment of
Mm,
education as well, I don't think.
mm,
So I'm really big on that because of who we become through the
yeah.
process of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that, yeah, in a world of that doesn't think very well, learning to think better and well and critically and holistically, I guess a question that pops into this is why it's wonderful to pick your brains in a way that I've never been able to do for a while. Um, how do you navigate a world that doesn't you can learn to think better and more critically, but you've got to engage with the bunch of people that don't want to. I know
A
that's what
lot,
drives me mad sometimes. I'm like,
a
I'm trying to
lot.
have a sane conversation here. How do we
Yeah.
do that?
I am learning the mastery of Jesus in asking questions.
Okay.
One of the questions that's been funny, and we've heard it from pop television, is, well, how's that working for you?
Mm,
Um, and I do it tongue in cheek and have fun with it. But reality is, how's this working?
yeah.
That we're not a thinking people anymore. So what happens?
Mm,
And you can go back to the uniqueness of the human species.
mm,
What do we have unique to us that no other creatures on the planet have? The understanding of our conscious thought and our subconscious thought, what
mm,
drives us, what we learned about fast and slow thinking,
mm,
how quickly we're made to respond, how our amygdala fires so much in neuroscience could help us so much if we would all really learn this.
yeah.
How this incredible thing that's in our head, the brain, works, and how much it affects what we do.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things.
Hmm.
I don't know about you, Jason, but when I learn things like that, I find myself just in a calm place because I think,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
People don't, I think it's because of the pace we live, we don't make room for complexity anymore.
No.
We don't want complex. We just want simple. Tell me what to do. Tell me
Mm,
what to think. And that is such a dangerous environment for the human species.
yeah. It is. I love what you say about questions because
Yeah.
it's like, hey, what do you think about this or this or this?
Yeah.
Um,
Because they have to stop and think
or refuse
or
to,
not.
or don't. In which case, you know,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
not going to get much further. Just go
Well,
around
it
saying,
almost becomes a challenge for me then
yeah,
keep probing, keep
yeah,
probing, what matters to them? I mean, what will get them to move on something or think about
yeah,
something? If you can
yeah,
get to the valuable things.
yeah, yeah. Like it, like it. So then going back to I talked about a second domain beyond skills. So critical thinking, if that's a key skill for leaders, resilience has been a huge thing. Everything related to it, grit, um, and fortitude, and everything else, and
Yeah.
sort of feel like you have to be a special forces operative
Mm.
to be to qualify as a leader to survive. Like, we're going to take you in your 20s and we're going to kidnap you and torture you, and then eventually, and you'll be able to cope with leadership in the church. But is joking aside about resilience, is that one of the main things that we really need, or is there another? I don't even know, what would you call resilience? An aptitude, isn't it, and a disposition.
Yeah, no, I think it's essential
Yeah.
because I think it's what leads to hope, Jason.
Right.
Um, Resilience for me aligns to the word faithfulness,
Mm-hmm.
and that leads to hope.
Yeah.
And there's only one thing that I have found that builds resilience in me, and
Mm-hmm.
it's bearing up under suffering. And we don't like to talk about this. I
No.
often think about, oh, had we thought differently about suffering?
Yeah.
as a church if
Mm.
we had truly understood the
Yeah.
beauty of it. And I was
Yeah.
reading one day in Peter's letters, and we studied this in seminary, and it has radically changed the way I think about this. And that
Mm.
was when he said, "To this you were called,
Mm.
to this you were called,
Mm.
and you have an example."
Mm.
And then he describes that example as being Christ. And that word in the Greek, that hupogrammos, has just become
Yeah.
so powerful to me.
Mm.
That bearing up under suffering,
Mm.
having the Father forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean you're not vulnerable. That's why we need the Gethsemane conversation.
Yeah.
You know, it's really important. He was his most vulnerable moment right then.
Mm.
I'm so grateful that's recorded in the Gospels.
Mm.
And that bearing up under
Mm.
and walking through,
Yeah.
and even saying, "Why have you forsaken me?
Mm.
Is there not another way to do this?" That's all a part of
Yeah.
growing resilience.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, that all these great books that lead to things on resilience and grit and, who survives and who doesn't, and then behavioral science, behavioral psychology and neuroscience are discovering more and more that to thrive and grow, we have to learn to bear up under discomfort, distress, and suffering, and that's what leads to real growth and purpose and meaning and stuff.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
you're like, hang on a minute, that's our game, isn't it, for Christians? Isn't that like pick up your cross daily, follow me?
Exactly.
So we've got a world that seems less able to cope with pain and suffering, and then we've got versions of Christian faith that are, if you are suffering, something's wrong, and you're like, no,
Exactly.
you're right in the center of God's purposes for your life. What do we do as leaders for, not just for ourselves but with others at that
Oh,
intersection?
this is a core discipleship issue for me, Jason.
Mm.
This is one of the things that my own research and work, the churches that were doing this really well, and that's the part of that whole life on life, walking through it together and
Mm.
talking about it and recognizing. I just heard AJ Swoboda talk about slow theology, and he quoted an author that I've read and loved, the book, A 3 Mile an Hour God,
Yeah.
and talking about, the pace that Jesus walked is the pace he discipled people.
Mm.
And we're in such a fast pace, we want everything instant. You don't grow resilience instantly.
Mm.
It's a long journey of upward climbing and falling in pits and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Because on the other side of it, you look back and go, "Oh, and now we know
Mm.
that he makes all things work together for our good." And I preach this often.
Mm.
That verse by itself does not work. If you just take Romans 8:28, it does not work. It you can put it on a refrigerator as a promise all you want. You don't
Mm.
understand 8:28 unless you read 29 and even all of chapter 8 to understand that is a chapter about suffering.
Yeah.
And the promise is that the sons of God are revealed
Mm.
in glory, and
Yeah.
it's through this. And that picture of helping people understand the
Mm.
strength, the inner core, the
Mm.
rootedness, your systems. I love everything agrarian, probably because I grew up with a farmer.
Mm.
But I love everything agrarian. And you look at the trees and the deep rootedness.
Mm.
The deeper those roots go,
Mm.
or for redwoods, the more they spread out and entangle with those next to them. Those are two metaphors that are just beautiful to think about, to draw
Mm.
strength, to weather storms.
Yeah.
That's what makes them grow and strong. And I was in a museum recently, and it was the part of it, they'd cut the tree and showing you the rings of a tree. And I stood there,
Mm.
struck by what all that tree had endured
Mm.
to be as large as it was.
Mm.
And every ring, I thought, every ring represents a story of time,
Mm.
of seasons, of
Mm.
challenges, of difficulty. And it was
Mm.
huge. And it only got that way because of what it endured.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How we encourage one another and have a spirituality of participation. You
Yes.
know, these are the sufferings of Christ. They're how we experience resurrection, not
Exactly.
running away or avoiding. Um,
Exactly.
so, so let me ask you about. I mean, you might be related to this. You talked about differentiation, and it's again, I'm putting things in, sort of parking them in. There's a skills piece that you need. There's the general aptitude, dispositions, resilience and grit and all that kind of stuff. But there's I don't know, it's the emerging bit at the moment, and they all overlap like a Venn diagram in many ways. But yeah, that being a non-anxious presence and differentiated, just again how absolutely we've already touched on it and key that is to be centered, to be an anchor in the middle of the storm that everybody else is in. I wish I could go back to a younger me and give them Friedman's book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, tell me a bit more about what that means for
Yeah.
you, that non-anxious presence
You
and
know,
practice as a leader.
the word that comes for me here is always becoming. Um,
Right.
I think all of life, especially in faith in Christ, is becoming. It's becoming more human,
Hmm.
more whole.
Yeah.
The idea that salvation, I think it's part of, I use a very elementary idea here about what salvation, what we've done to it is if you take a pie
Mm.
and you slice it in 8 pieces, different denominations pull out a slice or two and call it the gospel.
Yeah.
And the reality is, it's the whole thing.
Mm.
It's all things becoming new, including us.
Mm.
It's becoming whole. That's
Mm.
what salvation really is, wholeness, integration.
Yeah.
And I think for us to
Mm.
get fully to that understanding,
Mm.
then we say, okay, well, where are the malformed, broken parts of myself that creates the shadow self, the dark side, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
because it's not whole,
Yeah.
it's not integrated. And unfortunately, and you and I have seen this as of a lot of people listening to this, is that we see leadership not out of a whole self
Mm.
that then does harm and damage to others.
Yeah.
And as leaders, we are responsible first to lead ourselves.
Mm.
And that is what qualifies us then to lead others.
Yeah.
And that getting to that place of wholeness, doing the hard work, it's hard work to go back and deal with the broken places.
Mm.
I've done a lot of work, Jason, with writings of Jim Wilder,
Oh
Dr.
yeah.
Jim Wilder, who's a neurotheologian.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
sat with him 2 different occasions. I told him, "You look right into my soul. I feel totally seen and heard, exposed, not all positive in a wonderful way."
Yeah.
And reading his writings of living from the heart Jesus gave you, and
Mm.
really looking through the different seasons of my life
Mm.
and asking those questions that
Mm.
from the Ignatian spirituality of Jesus, where were you and what do you want me to know about this moment,
Yeah.
has brought the depth of wholeness I can't even explain to you. And I'm almost 64 years old and probably more hope and joy filled than I've ever been in my life.
Wow.
And it's because of this deep sense of wholeness.
Yeah.
And so that's why I say the motivation for my leadership now is I want everybody to experience this. I
Hmm.
want the world to know God's original intention for us is good.
Mm.
And that goodness of God that I was referencing in Romans 8:28 that goes to 8:29 is says, "For now we know
Mm.
that those who us were predestined to be conformed to the image of his son." That's the good of God,
Yeah.
is to conform us to the image of Christ. And so then all things
Mm.
work toward that good
Yeah.
when we work with it. And it's
Mm.
hard work. but it's such rewarding work for you and for everyone around you.
Yeah.
Then you add your resilience and your
Mm-hmm.
competencies, and you grow in your skills.
Mm.
One thing that I fear, I grew up in the era of leadership training in the church. So the late 70s, early 80s, everything was about leadership and church growth. And one of the things that I've watched us humans do is this pendulum swings back and forth and back and forth. And everything that was in its bucket, when it swings, gets thrown out. And so we go back to these things over here, and then we throw it out and we go back over here. And I'm going, what if
Yeah.
we stopped here and we brought the best of both sides,
Mm.
both worlds?
Yeah.
To me, that's what a leader does. It doesn't throw out everything over here. And there's some really important leadership training.
Yeah.
I don't want us to throw that bucket out because we got harmed by leadership. We say, no, no, no. There's some really important stuff in there. Like one of the first lines I heard was, you teach what you know, but you reproduce who you are.
You teach what
One
you
of
know, but reproduce who you
the
are.
very first lines I heard, probably
Mm.
in 1980, about leadership.
Yeah.
Well, then that says, then who I am
Yeah.
matters far more than what I know.
Yeah.
But I don't throw out knowing.
Yeah.
This is where I'm saying we become collectors of the good. That's
Collectors of
what
the good.
wholeness is, collectors of the good, and bring all of the good together to create
Yeah.
wholeness.
Yeah. I'll throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah,
Well, maybe we could model some vulnerability
yeah,
here on, guess, moving to this type of question, which is about what's some of the hardest leadership lessons you've learned the hard way because of who
mm,
you are. So
yeah,
I could start off and say, hey, I had work shy parents and nearly made me homeless and struggled with control and providence and, we became a workaholic. But that's easy, you see, because everyone loves a recovered workaholic because at least had a good Protestant work ethic and were industrious. It's not like I did drugs and gambled. I found that one quite socially acceptable. Being a workaholic is like,
oh,
oh, that's
absolutely,
terrible, but good for you. But let me talk about another one. I'll go first, and while
yeah,
you're getting yours ready. So my, brokenness background parents seriously underestimated having been abandoned by my father. It was just I became a walking cliche of if I care enough for people, they won't leave.
right.
So, you plant a church and be a church planter and people come and people go.
Mm,
And I look back now, I think I spent so long, really what I was acting out was, if I love you and care for you, you won't leave me. And underneath that, the Lord showed me I didn't think I was enough for my father to stay. So the only reason people would leave is because of me.
yeah,
And it wasn't until I read a book that a coaching friend gave me. He said, I really think you need to read this. I said, why? He said, trust me, read it and then we'll talk. It's a good friend. And it's called Stop. I mean, the title's terrible. It's called Stop the Pain. And I start reading it and it's like, about, there's all these things. I'm like, yes, all these terrible people. And then the punchline is, so why are you doing this to yourself? I'm like, I'm not doing this to myself. And then I'm like, oh no. I turned to my friend, I've been doing this, haven't I? Causing my own pain. He goes, let's talk about that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
realizing, okay. So that was really hard because you're trying to love and care for people. And it's like, no, I'm not loving and caring. I'm trying to look after myself. That was a really hard one to face up to and own. Yeah, that's one of mine.
yeah. Well, where do you begin? I've got a whole long list. I think I was the typical too, overly responsible because I was the adult. My mother was the child. She was clinically narcissist, very unhealthy woman. Couldn't
Yeah.
have children. Adopted me
Hmm.
to try to fix it all. And in the midst of that, it became abusive. I had a lot of abuse in my childhood, and
Hmm.
for years, I didn't even know it was that because whatever you grow up in, you think
Yeah.
is normal. Your perception is your reality. So
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that it was abusive until I got married and got into another family and went, oh, there's another way to live.
Hmm.
And for me, Jason, the overly responsible, she was very angry and volatile. So it was peace at any price. Keep the peace because the fight is not worth the pain. That what I just said is really big. Keep the
Wow.
peace
Keep the
because the
peace.
fight is not worth the pain.
Huh.
Really
Mm,
formed deeply within me. And when you're a peace at any price person
mm,
and you're doing it to keep the pain at bay,
mm.
then you can become duplicitous. You can become complicit.
Yeah.
All of those things that you can do in leadership. And it took me quite a few years to recognize
Mm,
because I think I'm keeping the organization
mm,
happy. I'm
yeah.
keeping the organization peaceful. I'm keeping it in harmony.
Yeah.
Um, and I realized that when you do that, you can get caught up in a dysfunctional system
Mm,
and you feed the system.
right. Yeah.
And some of my most painful lessons
Mm,
um, were being complicit to a system
mm,
instead of saying, wait a minute.
yeah.
Sometimes some of the hardest leadership decisions are when everything around you is working. I used to say it's like the swimming pool you get in and the current, everything is going around and around and around.
Mm,
And for someone to step into it and be a resistor,
mm,
um, we don't bode well. It's not good for the resistor and it's painful for the system. And yet, it's the only way change usually happens is with a resistor.
yeah.
Sometimes those loudest, most painful, difficult voices are the ones we need the most
Yeah.
because they're showing us, hey, wait, stop, time out. There's a system here that's been created, and because it's all working together, we don't see any problem with it.
I was going to say, what's the most difficult system you found yourself in? Is it the one that's complicit with your dysfunction? So it's like, hey, this is great. Or is it the one where it rubs against your dysfunction? Does that question make sense? You've been like, I don't like it like this. I want everything to be how I am. Or,
Well,
you know,
I think I learned pretty early on to recognize my dysfunction, and I will say to you, and I think it's the way I'm wired up.
yeah,
I don't let that sit very long.
okay,
'Cause I've watched so much harm be done at the hands of people's dysfunction.
yeah,
There's an assessment. Of course, there's hundreds of them out there, but the
mm,
one that my husband and I got into years ago called the Berkman. I think you're
mm,
familiar with it. And one part of it that it really stands out to me is
mm,
when you see your stress behaviors
mm,
and your motivations.
mm,
So I'm a person who I'm highly motivated for the sake of people. I mean, that's my intrinsic motivation is for
mm,
people.
yeah,
But the way I do it is often move down and away from people into task orientation to build a system. And the
mm,
reason why is because I know the beauty and the pain of systems and structures.
mm,
It's just like our human body.
yeah,
When it's healthy, you don't even recognize it, and it's a beautiful thing. But when
mm,
something gets ill, out of place, or broken,
yeah,
the whole body hurts. I think we read that somewhere.
yeah,
And so I don't tend to let dysfunction in me rest
mm,
very long. I'm probably too relentless about it.
mm,
But it is just equally as painful to get caught up in a system
yeah,
and then look at it and go, oh, I wish I'd resisted some things.
yeah. It's interesting. I've noticed you've used the word pain quite a few times. I probably have as well. Pain, how much of this is what we're doing is we're always managing pain, aren't we? I mean, we can call it discomfort, complexity,
Yeah.
fear of the past, uncertainty, all those kinds of things. And there's a pain, psychological pain, existential pain, physical pain, isn't it? And we try and manage. I'm just wondering how much of leadership is pain management and us learning to manage our pain well and appropriately so that other people can manage theirs and create virtuous systems for pain management. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say also always looking toward the healer.
Mm,
Um, I think there was a word, one of the friends or acquaintances I've interacted with is J.R. Woodward, and I loved when he wrote different terms for the five gifts of Ephesians 4. He called pastors soul healers.
Hmm.
And I
Nice.
love that term
Mm.
because I think that is, again, wholeness is we're
Yeah.
healing. We're in the healing business. And
Hmm.
I think that that idea is moving toward healing. And there's some pain you must manage and you can't fix.
Yeah.
Um, but that healing mindset helps me that I neither do I just sit in the pain and accept it and say, well, this
Yeah.
is just the way it is. Well, that's not always true. Sometimes that's a cop out,
Yeah.
and there are things I can do. Sometimes it requires more pain. When you
Mm.
break something to reset that bone or something gets dislocated, it requires more pain
Mm.
before the healing can begin.
Mm.
But yeah,
Mm.
pain is part of that inevitable, and again, what builds resilience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It does. Thank you. So, rounding up our time together, um, I pitched this to you. Say we'd just talk about leadership in general and this leadership moment and leadership crisis and what we're learning about leadership. Is there anything else about leadership? I imagine people watching this, going, "My world is mental at the minute."
Yeah.
So, process pain, find the healer, be vulnerable, all that stuff. Anything else about
Well,
leadership?
I
For
believe leadership's important, Jason. And like I said, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So
yeah,
we can talk about all the other aspects of it. But at the end of the day, we are all watching,
yeah,
whatever you think about it. Leaders can cause chaos, leaders can cause peace, leaders can. But I would say another aspect of this is that because sometimes when we just use the word leader,
mm,
people feel a weight that's not what leadership is. Those are different words, those are different things. And I think the
mm,
idea that leadership matters,
mm,
that chaos happens without it.
yeah,
We need good leadership, but it
mm,
can be done, like I said, in a myriad of ways. I've watched team leadership thrive and be far more sustainable. And I
mm,
think, and that's another whole topic, but I think done well, according to this body metaphor, it can really work beautifully. And I think the function of leadership
mm,
that moves something forward or brings peace when things can't move forward,
mm,
gives hope for a future,
mm,
it's hope for a preferable future.
mm,
That's what good leadership does.
mm,
That brings us through chaos and tells us it won't always be this way.
mm,
I was just reading in my daily office this morning the story of Moses over and again, going to the mountain. People got impatient. There's just so many good leadership lessons in
mm,
this. And Moses' patient obedience.
mm.
Yeah.
So, what makes it all? Last question then. What makes it all worthwhile? Why would, in the midst of leadership crisis and the way our world is, and people like, hey, I've seen what you older guys have been through. I'm not sure I want to do this. What might we say to invite people into the space to
Well,
practice
there's
leadership?
nothing more important than being a part of someone's hope and future
Mm,
healing and growth. And that's what leadership is. It's for the sake of others.
mm,
And to be a person who can help others
mm,
find hope and see Jesus and
mm,
can grow into the best version of themselves. For me, at this season of life, one of my greatest joys is sitting with young leaders. I was with two yesterday and listening to their dreams and what they're doing and
mm,
asking questions and them asking me questions
mm,
and just telling them it's all worth it. And they asked me this question: would you do it again?
mm.
Because we've been in ministry now 45 years.
Wow.
Um, and they said, would you do it again? And I said, in a minute. I don't even have to think about it. Would I do some things different? Absolutely. But would I do it again? Without question, because there is no greater calling in the world
Yeah.
than to follow Jesus and say to the others, "Follow me as I follow Christ."
Amen.
Yeah,
Amen. Well, what a great place for us to finish. Thank you, Tammy. Thanks
my
for being
pleasure.
here, and thanks for all those wonderful thoughts. And for anyone listening, wherever this is, there'll be all the links and details to find out more and read more about this and find out more about Tammy and other things that she's up to. Thank you. All
Thanks,
right.
Jason.
Bye.